Our last lecture for the semester will be the alternative and experimental dramatic and theatrical forms. Now, as we've discussed in previous lectures, and we talked about genres, we kind of had some clear definitions of what each play would kind of fall into. But in contemporary terms, some of these plays might not fit so clearly into each one of these genres. And some people have argued that by putting them in these genres, they're based on biases based off of socio-political and aesthetic biases. Some of those biases might be like, why should this play be considered important because it was written by this particular playwright at this particular time? And so many of the avant-garde forms of productions that we have don't fit so neatly into those categories, which is why we're going to be talking about the ones that we have today. Some of those are going to be the Expressionism and Surrealism. Now, these were developed early in the 20th century. And one of the ideas of what they were trying to do is they were trying to work on the inner mind, and they were trying to mimic the dream. We have to go back to the idea that Expressionism is the idea of an outward expression of an inward feeling. So whatever it was that the playwrights or the directors were trying to have, this inner feeling, they were trying to express it through the idea of sometimes with dream work. In Arthur Miller's play Death of a Salesman, they use expressionism to get into the mind of the protagonist, of Willy Loman. And we talk about the idea of the dream sequence. In Tony Kushner's play Angels in America, there was a lot of surrealism in a number of the dream scenes that were used to emphasize the AIDS crisis in America during the 1980s. Shortly after this, there was the introduction of what was called epic theater, also still under the alternative genres of theater. In the epic theater, it was first originally created by Bertolt Brecht, as a reminder to the audience members that they were actually in the theater. He did not want people to forget that they were in a theatrical production, and this idea they wanted to affect the audience, not so they could just turn off their brains and be carried on this journey. They wanted them to be involved. And his work was really took off between the two world wars and after. He used different ideas of breaking up action and used narration with songs so that the meanings of the action would actually come through stronger to the audience. And then many playwrights today use these same techniques in their dramas to also try to emphasize and to punch up certain elements of their drama that they're trying to affect the audience with. The next form of theater we're going to talk about is the theater of cruelty. Don't be misled by the title. This was developed by Antonin Artaud in the 1930s, and then he wanted to take the idea of the masterpieces. When we talk about the masterpieces, that would be the work of like Shakespeare and such, and bring them into more contemporary audiences. He believed that the play should have a fully sensory experience. So it wasn't just the idea of what you see and what you hear, that also smells and sound should also be affecting you. And he also wanted to get away from the idea, well, that's why it was called the theater of cruelty, because he wanted to offend all of the senses. And then they started getting away from the idea of the playwright's words as being sacred text. He wanted to get away from that and realize that the experience and what the director was putting in is just as important, if not more important, than the words themselves. Which then brings us to what was called the happenings. These events, these happenings were first created in the 1950s and 60s by artists and dancers. They weren't necessarily by theatrical people, but they weren't just spontaneous acts. These were very choreographed events that were intended to kind of like they say, explore space and time. And they did this by taking everyday movements that you might do as far as lifting something, mailing something, and then adding sounds and some text and some movements and some uh, uh, music to add feeling emotions that aren't necessarily involved in the text exactly. And they even also continued with the idea of the theater of cruelty, where they also evoked different other senses besides just the sight, with also sound and smell. And one of the things is that they definitely worked on eliminating the idea of the fourth wall. Remember, the fourth wall is the idea that there are three walls on stage, and the fourth wall separates you and the audience. This idea of happenings definitely, and all of these alternative theater genre, definitely wanted to impact and get right in the face of the audience members. The environmental theater, first coined in the 1960s, based off the work of Meyerhold and Ottawa. Um, this was where the entire space itself was affected, and the idea with that the spatial arrangement for the productions was transformed. This way, even the space itself that it was being performed in was supposed to impact the audience. This was heavily influenced by the work of Jerry Grotowski, Jerzy Grotowski, but he was later known as Jerry Grotowski, where he would arrange the audience and the space to conform to the play. This found a real home in New York and across the United States, dealing with images, impressions, segments, strong elements of improvisation, and audience participation. The idea was that if you took a space, and this was kind of discussed before, where if the space was supposed to be, well, the play was supposed to be like say Dracula, where would you put that? Where would you place that so that the space itself would also affect the audience? Maybe you put it in a haunted house or an old mansion or out in a graveyard or something like that. And this was the idea where the audience's placement and the arrangement of the audience had a different effect on that audience because of the production. Then it comes to postmodernism. Um, while some people use the term postmodernism a lot, excuse me, um, it's really hard to define, but there are some characteristics. And with that, one of the main ones is that it questions the idea of art. Um, they're saying certain artists have given certain privileges throughout history. And this idea is they want to rebel against that idea. When we say some artists have been given privilege, we have ideas of Moliere and of Shakespeare, names we know that are very white European. And throughout history, they're given this heightened place. And they also believe that the audience members should be able to create their own reading of the material. And they really wanted to blur this line of what's considered high art and popular art. Whenever you say pop art, people always have a kind of a negative connotation to that. But postmodernism believed that any kind of art had its value. And one kind of example was the Julie Taylor's use of puppets for a lot of her productions. She's a very popular Shakespearean director. And this idea of using puppets that's borrowed from the Asian theater was used in her direction of Shakespeare's The Tempest. This is on stage, this puppetry work. Then we have the idea of the performance art. Performance artists, you probably heard that term before. Very often some of these performances would be questioning the audience, and I mean directly questioning the audience on a number of things, while not always be politically minded. In the 1970s, they really emphasized the body as kind of this object of art, and it was very movement based sometimes. It was the idea of that very actory, theatery presentation that we think of when we think about theater in the 70s. And they became very site specific, such as parks, piers, and even transportation centers. One of the main things that happened out of the performance art was that story, character, and text were often eliminated. Instead, the artist was actually the messenger, and there would be a very personal or political message. And this kind of performance art has really grown until the individual artists are now presenting some long form, one person autobiographical performances. And some names you might have heard of. Here are a list of some of them and some of the subject matter that they've done. Karen Finley, Anna Smith, John Leguizamo, and Ping Chong. All of these are long form, one person acts that have a very distinct message and is trying to present to a larger audience something from their experiences in their life. And the last bit is going to be bridging the traditional and the non-traditional. Two forms that are really not easy to categorize into the genres are the political theater and the documentary theater. In the political theater, playwrights were using different aesthetic approaches. Remember, we talked about the aesthetic distance. The aesthetic approaches in order to reinforce their political views. This was done very often by Bertolt Brecht, who we talked about just a little while ago. And also, all the way up to recently, where New York's Public Theater had a very controversial staging of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar using former President Donald Trump's administration as a backdrop of this Shakespearean production. And then there's the documentary drama that is actually rooted in the Greek and Elizabethan theater, using historical context. And their idea and their feeling was, even though they did take some poetic license, their idea was to try to convince the audience that they were actually watching history unfold right in front of them. And while at the same time still having kind of a political view of this historical event that happened. I hope everyone had a very good semester. Please remember to log on to make sure that you're taking your final test and final quizzes, and I hope you guys have a great break.